He's seen the transfiguration of a man into a wolf.
So I took the prostitute inside.
I'm not going to go before the public and start talking about a werewolf.
I just had the feeling that ultimately I would kill somebody.
It all started with a dream, or so he thought at the time at least. On the outside, Bill Ramsey came across as a nice, polite, normal man. But something, at least within his subconscious, was bothering him. For multiple years he kept having the same recurring dream. He would enter his home on a warm spring morning, the early sun beaming in through the window, illuminating his wife, who was standing at the sink washing up plates. He would approach her from behind, calling her name gently, happy to see her. His wife would turn to face him, but the smile on her face would instantly drop as she locked eyes with Bill. Her hands reached up to her face, and she began to scream. A terrified, pained scream as she caught sight of her husband. A scream so piercingly loud it caused Bill to retreat and run away from his wife. Although Bill could not see his own face in the dream, he somehow knew why she acted like this. He wasn't himself, or at least not the self his family were used to seeing. He had become some kind of monster. But it would be nearly 20 years later that events in Bill's life would really take a dark turn. December 5th, 1983. A nurse was standing outside the entranceway to Southend Hospital in Essex. It was 10 PM and she had snuck out front of the entrance to have a quick cigarette break. The winter's night was caked in a thick fog that made it difficult to see much beyond the lit up awning outside the hospital. It was a relatively quiet and normal night in the hospital, and she was the only one outside. That was when she heard it, for the first time. Footsteps, shuffling somewhere off in the fog. This on its own shouldn't have really been anything that unusual, but hearing those footsteps instantly set her mind going. She felt alone, vulnerable, and the events of the previous year suddenly flooded into her head. Another nurse had been out alone in the car park late one night, when she had been grabbed and raped by an unknown assailant. She nervously raised her cigarette to her mouth and listened as the footsteps gradually moved closer and closer, followed by the sounds of something dragging along the concrete. Now she was really terrified. She stubbed out her cigarette on the floor and looked back over her shoulder at the corridor behind her. Something inside her was telling her that she needed to get out of there, that whatever was inside that fog wasn't good. Her decision would be cemented when she finally saw the figure emerge from the fog. At first she saw that it appeared to just be a man. Maybe he was walking up to the hospital like any normal person would. Maybe her imagination had gotten the better of her. But then she noticed he wasn't walking like any normal man. He was hunched over, his hands contorted at his sides in an almost claw-like manner. Was the man in some kind of pain? In trouble? But then he just stopped moving, like he had seen the nurse and frozen. She called out to him, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there several feet away, barely visible in the night, staring back at her. She called out a second time, and this time, the man moved forward. Something about the way he moved told the nurse that she needed to get back inside and fast. She spun around and ran back inside the hospital. Once inside, she felt silly. It was just a man walking through a car park. Her imagination had made it into a much bigger situation than it needed to be. She had no idea that the man who walked in shortly after her and was now sitting in the accident and emergency waiting room, that man was Bill Ramsey. And before he would leave the hospital that night, a number of other people would be seeking emergency treatment. Welcome to the Tape Library. Tonight we're going to be getting into a case I've wanted to cover since I started this channel. Unfortunately, the vast majority of information that exists on this case comes from the ever controversial paranormal investigators and self-professed demonologists, Ed and Lorraine Warren. So we're going to be looking at their recounting of the story through the book they wrote on the case with Robert David Chase. but I've also been able to track down a few articles and interviews with the people involved, so hopefully we can piece together what elements of the story actually happened, and which parts are maybe a little less accurate. This is a tale that takes place over the course of around 40 years in total. I couldn't not tackle this, because out of all the stories involving Ed and Lorraine Warren, I think, on paper at least, this may be one of the most insane I've ever read. As with most of the stories I present on this channel, I bring you the events as they were reported by the people who claim to experience them, but we'll also be getting into other possible explanations and versions of events later on. I try as much as possible to leave it up to you to decide what you believe. So get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. It's time to get into the wild world of the Southend Werewolf. I think to truly get into what makes this story so unique is just how normal a place something so fantastical apparently took place. When we think of stories of werewolves, I don't think many of us immediately jump to the image of the seaside. Maybe more at that time than it is these days. Southend-on-Sea was a popular holiday destination for many people across the UK, but particularly those around London. Only about an hour away from the city, it's the perfect place to get away from the bustle of city life for a few days and enjoy the beach. The town is based on the banks of the Thames estuary, the place where London's major river meets the sea. It's your typical English seaside resort, complete with sticks of rock, a theme park, mile of arcades, and the longest pleasure pier in the world. To call it small would be underselling it, with a population of around 160,000 at the time most of the events took place. While over the years it has become more of a commuter city, it has a strong working class background to it. It is not the place you expect to find Ed and Lorraine Warren chasing after a werewolf, and I'm sure Bill Ramsey didn't expect his life to end up that way either, when he was born in Southend in 1943 to a country still at war. The first incident that Ramsey would experience actually came at the age of 9, but he apparently repressed the memory of this event and wouldn't remember it until much later in his life. In 1965 he married his wife Abby and had 3 children, all within the span of a few years. It was during this period that the dreams began. The dream of him approaching his wife in the kitchen, of her being horrified by his appearance. At first he passed it off as just that, a dream, but it kept coming back to him time and time again for years. He would wake up drenched in sweat, Abby complaining that he had been thrashing around violently in bed, before the dream seemed to abruptly stop sometime in 1967. A year and a half passed with nothing unusual happening, until Bill once again woke up in his bed, one cold winter's night. His wife was sound asleep, but Bill had been jolted awake by something. He just wasn't sure what, when he heard a sound in the darkened bedroom. The sound of a low rumbling, almost like a growl. He glanced around the room terrified, trying to work out what could be making the sound, convinced there was something hiding in one of the darkened corners of the room, getting ready to launch an attack on him, when he suddenly realised the sound was close, very close in fact. It was coming from Bill, a low grumbling growl emanating from his chest. A few months later, the Ramsey family was sat around eating dinner, while the TV played the universal classic, The Wolfman. Abby made a comment about how much Bill loved the film, but he had an unexpected outburst at this fairly innocent comment, shouting at his wife that maybe he was sick of the Wolfman. Abby didn't understand what she had done to upset her husband so badly, and Bill didn't know why he reacted in such a strong way. He immediately left the house and went for a walk to calm down, when he was suddenly hit with a memory, the same memory I mentioned he had repressed since the age of 9. The first of what would be a series of strange episodes. The year was 1952 and Bill was playing alone in his back garden on a sunny Saturday afternoon, when he was suddenly hit with a cold wave that seemed to engulf his entire body. Bill described it almost like walking into a large refrigerator after being outside on a hot day. It was a sudden, all-encompassing feeling. He began to shake and could smell a strange, unpleasant odour all of a sudden, feeling like he was about to throw up from this sensation. But then, it just seemed to pass. His body temperature returned to normal. The smell faded away, but he still felt different somehow. He walked up to the fence and looked in the direction of where the sea would be. The young Bill was hit with the sudden urge for true freedom. He felt compelled to run towards the beach, steal a boat, and get away from people so they wouldn't know the truth about him. A truth that Bill himself couldn't even explain. There was something about him that was different to other people. He just didn't know what. He then suddenly started to think about the film, The Wolfman, and that he too felt the same. Like a wolf, he began to see himself in his mind as a wolf. While he was lost in this world of fantasy, his mother called out for him to come inside. The instruction filled Bill with a sense of intense rage that he had never felt before. He turned and tripped on the fence post that he had been stood next to. He stood up and with blind anger, he gripped the fence post that was buried deep into the ground and ripped it up. His parents came rushing out into the garden to see their 9-year-old boy waving a heavy fence post above his head like it was nothing. The wire fencing is still attached, twisting and contorting as he waved it around in anger, before throwing it to the ground and proceeding to begin biting the wire. His father tried to pull the boy away, but he couldn't. Bill claims it was only the sound of his mother crying that caused him to snap out of it. The feeling of pain in his hands and mouth suddenly hit him. He had sliced them open without even realizing it. Then Bill began to growl, his lips curling, staring at his parents with the same rage he had felt towards the fence post. They ran inside, locking the door behind them. Just moments ago their son had been playing in the garden. Now they were locking themselves inside, terrified of a 9-year-old boy. After a few moments the growling stopped, and the sound of a timid knock on the back door could be heard, along with the sobbing of Bill. His parents opened the door and rushed to hug him. None of them understood what had just happened. Bill would claim that throughout his childhood he would see visions of wolves in his mind, and sometimes look down at his own hands and imagine them as claws. He said he would often feel an intense anger within him, but nothing like he had experienced on that day. Over time, Bill learned to forget about that day. His parents certainly didn't want to talk about it, and it became a shameful moment in his childhood that his brain decided to protect him from. After his random outburst to Abby about the Wolfman, and the sudden revelation of his childhood trauma, Bill settled back down again. He had the odd dream and strange feeling, but for the most part he lived a normal life. It wouldn't be until the early 1980s that things really started to take a turn for him. One autumn, in the early 80s, Bill began to notice the familiar feelings again. He claimed he felt drawn to go on long walks at night alone, staring up at the sky, the images of wolves filling his mind once again, but not acting out at all. On one of those nights, Bill mentions walking past a church and feeling drawn to it for some unknown reason. However, in later interviews I saw, Bill makes it very clear that he was not a religious man. One Sunday night, Bill was finishing up work with 2 of his colleagues when they suggested they should head to the pub, which Bill agreed to do. He noticed, however, as he approached the pub, a familiar cold chill entering his body and then passing. A few hours and a few pints in the pub passed. Just before leaving, Bill nipped to the toilet, where he saw his reflection in the mirror. He swore that he saw, only for a moment, the face of a wolf. The 3 men began to drive home, with the one sober member of the group driving, and Bill and his other colleagues sat in the back, when Bill was suddenly hit with a violent, overwhelming urge to attack the man sat next to him, his friend and colleague, a man who at this point had done nothing to anger Bill. The images of the wolf entered his mind once again. The cold spread throughout his body when he suddenly let out an uncontrollable growl that appeared to build up from his belly before escaping his lips. Both the driver and the man sat next to Bill immediately became concerned about the strange noises he was suddenly making, At first they thought he was messing around, until Bill turned and attacked the man next to him, scratching at his face, growling and shrieking as he did. The man attempted to defend himself, which only saw Bill then bite into his leg. The driver pulled to the side of the road, and after several minutes of struggling, they were able to pin Bill down and stop his violent attack. A few moments passed and Bill began to soften in their grip. His growls ceased. Sensing that he had calmed down, they loosened their grip on him, and Bill pulled the door open, running out of the car. Bill ran off towards the nearby woods and stood there in shock with what he had just done. Luckily, even after the attack, his friends weren't willing to just leave Bill there. They knew this wasn't normal behaviour for him. Something had happened. Something serious. Eventually they were able to coax Bill back into the car. The three men nervously finished the drive home, with Bill not saying a word. Bill was woken up later that night by his wife, who told him he was scaring her, that he was growling in his sleep. When he fell back asleep, Bill began to dream that he was a wolf, being chased by hunters. Over breakfast the next day, Bill told Abby everything, that as ridiculous as it all sounds, he was scared that he was somehow turning into a wolf. Abby, worried that her husband was overworking, simply asked him to cut back a bit and relax. He didn't, but for the next year and a half Bill had no further issues. Abby made sure to keep a close watch on her husband though, clearly worried about his mental state. But after time, Bill began to be awoken by the same familiar nightmares. One night Abby found him standing at the window in the middle of the night, repeatedly touching his own face, as though he didn't believe it was his. He had been crying. Christmas was fast approaching, and Bill was now working as a taxi driver. Something about his behaviour was beginning to worry Abby again. She asked him to stay home that night, but Bill said he couldn't. He would come to regret that choice. As he was driving late at night, he suddenly felt a pain in his chest, and was hit with cold sweats. Convinced he was either having or about to have a heart attack, Bill drove himself to the hospital as quickly as he could. As he stepped out of the car, the pain was still present in his chest, but was now also shooting down his right arm. He staggered out of the car, stumbling around in an odd, uncontrollable manner. He could see the entrance, but the night was foggy, and his vision was blurred. Still, he awkwardly stumbled towards the entrance of the hospital. As he walked in, he collapsed to the floor. The nurses rushed to his aid, and he soon found himself in a hospital bed, with his symptoms seemingly beginning to fade away. But after some time, Bill began to feel a rumbling sensation in his belly. At first he thought it was just indigestion, but it appeared to move up his body, towards his mouth, where he would then let out what the nurses heard as a loud roar, making everyone freeze in their tracks. The image of wolves once again flooded his mind's eye. He felt his hands begin to cup, taking on an almost claw-like posture. The growling continued. He then tried to stand up. One nurse stood forward and tried to calm Bill, asking him to lay back down. He swatted a hand towards her. She persisted again, to try and get him back onto the bed. And it nearly worked. He seemed to calm, momentarily at least, from her kind tone of voice, before roaring again and biting the woman's arm. The other nurses all rushed towards Bill, trying to pull him off as the nurse's blood dripped between his lips, refusing to let go. A police officer who had been in the waiting room came rushing in when he heard the screams. There, he found a group of nurses trying to calm a man who was in the corner of the room, growling. Furniture had been thrown all around the room. The police officer was joined by another hospital staff member, and the pair tried to talk calmly to Bill as they approached him, who responded by throwing a chair in their direction. Then Bill launched himself at the policeman and attempted to bite him. This gave the other man the opportunity to grab Bill from behind, and between the two of them, they were able to restrain him in one of the beds. He moved so violently once restrained that the policeman thought he would snap the restraints, so he quickly handcuffed Bill too. A doctor entered the room and injected Bill with an antipsychotic drug. Bill awoke sometime later, confused and with seemingly no memory of what had taken place. He was even more shocked when the paramedics told him they were taking him to Runwell, the local mental hospital. Bill describes his memory of being wheeled into Runwell as a fairly dazed and confused experience. He was highly medicated at this point, but still remembers the shouts and screams of distant patients and how the tone of the light made everything feel dirty. He said how he felt the other people in the hospital had twisted, strange features, and described the experience as like entering hell. Part of him knew that he had bitten someone, but he didn't know who or if they were okay. Bill saw the strange new world he had entered as the punishment for his misdeeds in his dreamlike drugged state. Drips of memories from the previous night began to come back to him, and he began to worry about how his community would treat him once they knew he had ended up in Runwell. After a while, Bill was taken to a room to speak with a doctor. He asked Bill if he had ever experienced something like this before, and Bill spoke of the times previous where he felt he had been somehow turning into a wolf. He told the doctor everything about his previous experience, or at least as much as he could remember. The doctor asked Bill if he would be willing to stay at the hospital. No one was pressing charges and he was here voluntarily. If he wanted to leave, he was free to do so, but the doctor warned he thinks this will happen again, and they could get him some help. Bill declined. Within just a few hours, he was back home. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Ed and Lorraine Warren were at home in Connecticut when Lorraine opened an envelope. Inside was a book. The couple were often sent books from other writers in the field of the paranormal, but for some reason Lorraine took a special interest in this one. It was about the history of werewolves. Just 2 days later, they flew over to England to work on a number of other cases and make some media appearances. They had no idea at this point who Bill Ramsey was. Meanwhile, Bill was adjusting to his new life post the attack. While his family had welcomed him back with open arms, he couldn't help but notice the whispers and odd looks from the other people in his life. It would be just 1 month later, in late January of 1984, when Bill would suffer another attack. Once again he was driving, when he felt his body turn cold, his jaw tighten, and the images of wolves began to flood his mind once again. The intense rage began to overtake him. Scared he would do something crazy to a member of the public, Bill quickly drove himself back to the hospital. The hospital was much quieter this time. Only one nurse was in the waiting area when Bill arrived. She seemingly thought Bill was drunk, considering he stumbled in and was rambling on about a wolf, so she asked him to sit down while she went to find a doctor. Bill was pleading that he needed help desperately when he noticed his hands once again curling into a claw shape. In the blink of an eye, the nurse was on the floor. Bill had sent her flying across the room. 2 patients hearing the crash came to investigate. They advanced on Bill, who sent both men flying in different directions. Growling, he ran down the corridor deeper into the hospital as the nurses desperately phoned for help. Bill caused chaos in the hospital, destroying furniture and assaulting anyone who got in his way. A doctor at one point stood in Bill's path. Bill raised the larger man off the floor and threw him into a wall. Bill continued to run from room to room, attacking people and terrifying them with his inhuman growls. By now the police were rushing around the hospital, trying to track him down. Eventually 4 officers managed to corner Bill in a dead end of the hospital. Bill briefly contemplated throwing himself through the glass window behind him, but luckily the 4 policemen advanced on him before he could. Eventually they were able to handcuff him. But in the struggle, one officer was so badly hurt he ended up hospitalised for 4 days. Once the cuffs were on, Bill instantly began to calm down and became full of the realisation of what he had just done. Bill was taken in by the police and kept in a holding cell before being taken to see the police surgeon. Bill was more sheepish with this man than the previous doctor he had spoken to. He described these attacks as some sort of seizure, but specifically mentioned that he wasn't epileptic. The police surgeon spoke to him about the idea of heading back to Romwell. He said, based on the tests they had done that night, that he didn't believe Bill was psychotic, but that he did appear to have delusional fantasies about turning into a wolf. Bill said he didn't want to go back to Romwell, to which he was told that if the police have to take him in one more time, he will not have a choice in the matter. And with that, Bill Ramsey was a free man, once again. Despite 2 attacks in such a short space of time, Bill was able to go 2 years without any major instances. During the time, he learned about the condition of clinical lycanthropy and wondered if that could explain what was happening to him, which led him to read about historical accounts of people with the condition that seemed in multiple cases to end with murder and cannibalism. While he didn't undergo any major attacks, he did continue to have the dreams of being a wolf. It was now July 1987, a warm evening. Bill had been drinking at the White Horse pub. Parked outside was a van that he had borrowed from work. While sat there, alone, and enjoying a couple of beers, Bill came up with a frankly bizarre idea that came out of nowhere. A 19-year-old prostitute named Lorraine was standing at the side of the road on the seafront that evening, looking for clients, when she noticed a van driving slowly along. At first, she thought it was someone looking to pick up a girl, but something about the way it was moving made her uneasy, so she began to walk along the road. The van followed, keeping pace with the young girl, hanging behind her, the man at the wheel staring at her intensely. Suddenly the van pulled ahead and stopped just a few feet away from her. Lauren nervously approached the window. That is when she saw Bill. And from their brief exchange, Lauren figured he was looking for a girl, but he came across as quiet and shy. At first, Lauren tried to make an excuse, but she felt at ease with him and agreed to go for a ride with him, as Bill put it. But once they started driving, Bill went silent. Lauren nervously asked him if he was okay, but he just ignored her. It was only after Lauren started protesting that she wanted to get out that Bill broke his silence. He claimed that he was putting her under citizen's arrest, that she was too young to be a prostitute, and he was taking her to the police. There seems to be some confusion about what exactly Bill was doing here. In the book, it makes it sound like he formulated this plan to effectively arrest a prostitute while he was in the pub, but then at the same time, Bill makes it sound like a snap decision, that he didn't understand why he did it, even suggesting that maybe he wanted to take her somewhere safe because he felt the urge to harm her. But sure enough, Bill took her to the police station. As soon as the van pulled up, Lauren ran straight into the station, clearly not feeling safe to simply walk away from Bill, leaving the door to the van wide open. Bill sat there, alone and in silence. When the familiar feelings in his body began, the visions began to flood his mind. A police officer was now walking towards Bill's van, and he stepped out, headed straight towards Officer Terry Fisher, a man who had 25 years of service under his belt, and a considerably much larger man than Bill Ramsey. The sounds of dogs from nearby kennels filled the air, suddenly barking and howling out of nowhere. Fisher could instantly tell that Bill was drunk, and began speaking to him, but Bill just stared blankly, He reached out to Bill's arm to try and guide him into the station, hoping to get to the bottom of what was going on, when he heard a sudden growl. But this wasn't one of the dogs. It was the man standing in front of him. Bill leapt on Fisher immediately and began scratching and biting him as the officer attempted to bat Ramsey off of him. Fisher says that he has never encountered anything like it in all his years on the force. Nothing he did seemed to be able to stop Ramsey. It was like he had superhuman strength, with a demented look in his eyes, and as several officers noted, his lips curled upwards to reveal his teeth as he growled. Eventually Bill was able to get his hands around Officer Fisher's throat and began to choke him. Fisher was slowly beginning to lose consciousness and was convinced that he was about to die. But Bill did something other than just growl this time around. He began to shout over and over, "When the devil's in me, I am strong." It took a dozen police officers to eventually get Bill under control, and luckily they were able to do it before he killed Terry Fisher. It even took numerous sedatives to finally stop his vicious attack. A number of the officers described his behaviour and appearance as being like a werewolf. Even once in his cell, any time an officer came close, Ramsey would try to bite and scratch. The sedatives didn't appear to be lasting long. 2 hours later, Ramsey woke up, back in Romwell. Officer Terry Fisher was so disturbed by the incident that he took early retirement shortly after. He said he was never able to even look at Bill Ramsey again, and was plagued with nightmares of the incident for years after the fact. Bill was committed under the Mental Health Act, and they were able to keep him in Romwell for up to 28 days. But after just 10 days, Bill was released again. Numerous tests were run on him, and the doctors apparently couldn't diagnose any possible mental or physical reasons for his behaviour, beyond a possible suggestion that he may be an alcoholic. Bill was apparently clinically sane. This time, Bill's antics made the news, with his attack even making the front page of the Sun newspaper. He claims that he was hounded by the press and seemingly became something of an outcast in his community. Bill was at his wit's end, with no idea where to turn next. But this publicity meant he soon attracted the attention of the Warrens, who were still in the country and had seen the story about Bill on the television. The Warrens, seemingly a little confused about where Southend was, contacted and visited numerous police stations in London, trying to find out about Bill Ramsey, before finally phoning Southend police station and speaking to an officer there who was happy to talk about what had happened. During the intervening days or weeks, the Warrens' books suggest that Bill had further run-ins with the police, including one incident where he fought up to 20 of them, although strangely very few details are given on these two later attacks. In a later interview, Ed Warren said he wasn't sure about this case. He thought it was a little too out there for them to get involved with, worried it may hurt their credibility. But Lorraine was insistent that they needed to try and help this man. The police officer who spoke with the Warrens apparently got in touch with Abby and Bill and told them that the Warrens were trustworthy people that they could talk to. With this endorsement from the police, Bill agreed to meet up with them. They met in a restaurant initially. They pushed Bill to explain his story, a story that Lorraine claimed he understated initially. After hearing everything, Ed told Bill that he believed he was possessed by the spirit of a wolf, that this was a spiritual problem, not a physical or mental one, and a problem that could only be solved by exorcism. Bill, quite understandably, thought that Ed Warren was insane, but he was insistent that Bill should come to America. There they could use a bishop they worked with on more than one occasion, Bishop McKenna, to exorcise the spirit from him, once and for all. Bill was unsure, but the group met up a second time at the Anne Boleyn pub, a place that interestingly has its own fair share of ghost stories, and Ed described the entity that was possessing Bill with a more specific term this time. He called it demonic. Bill said that he couldn't afford a trip to America, but the Warrens told him not to worry about that and they could handle it. Eventually, after much debate, he agreed. Before they were able to leave, however, Bill had a random attack of the rage in his own home that saw him backhand the family's dog across the room. Abby pleaded with him to stop, begging him not to hurt their pet, and something about Abby's voice brought Bill back around. This cemented his decision. He needed to go to America with the Warrens. At this point, he was willing to try anything, no matter how silly it sounded. But the way the Warrens planned to handle Bill's expenses was by getting him to sell his story to another tabloid paper, The People. The paper decided it would send a reporter and photographer with the Ramseys. But it would seem Ed Warren wasn't in a big rush to get this demonic wolf possession issue sorted, and it would be several months until the arrangements were made for the Ramseys to fly over to America. Once there, Bill met up with the Warrens and was introduced to Father Robert McKenna, a frail old man who would be the one conducting Bill's exorcism. The night before the exorcism, Bill suffered another seizure, as he had begun to call them, this time attacking his wife, attempting to bite at her throat as he growled like an animal. Once again, Abby spoke to him calmly, asking him to come back, asking him to stop what he was doing. And sure enough, once again it worked. Seemingly Abby was one of the few people who could control the beast that was living inside of Bill Ramsey. Now, the Warrens' book gets into a frankly strange side plot at this point, at the last minute, that I will briefly recap. It speaks of a reporter named Chuck Vogel who is introduced by us by explaining that he was sleeping with a woman who would cry after they had sex and talk about how much she missed her Nazi biker boyfriend. I have no idea what that has to do with anything, but there you go. Vogel gets word about Ramsey being flown into town and the exorcism that is due to take place. He decides to attend the church on the day that he has been informed that it is happening and write a story about it. But the following morning, Vogel wakes up, looks in the mirror and is shocked by what he sees. There, clear as day, is the symbol of a pentagram, seemingly burned into his forehead. Rather than heading to the hospital, Vogel instead seeks out a priest who tells Vogel that he can't see the pentagram. Vogel looks in the mirror again, but he can still see it. Confused by this, the priest suggests that maybe this is a warning, that Vogel should stay away from the exorcism. Vogel plans to listen to the priest, but says that he still found himself driving past the church on the day the exorcism was due to take place, and rather than continue on, he pulled the car to the side of the road and entered the church. He was instantly hit with the feeling that he shouldn't be there. No one else was at the church yet, and he stood there alone, feeling sick to his stomach. Or at least, he thought he was alone. Vogel apparently heard the sound of the confessional door opening. He glanced over. There, he saw, staggering away from the confessional, a figure that appeared to be wrapped in rags, walking towards him. As it made its way up the centre aisle, it stared directly at Vogel, and he got a good look at its face, covered in open sores, its eyes glowing red. Vogel ran, screaming from the church. He was soon home and sat up the entire night with a gun in his hand, vowing to never investigate any paranormal stories ever again. The Warrens, Father McKenna, nor the Ramseys saw any such figure when they arrived at the church though, and the exorcism soon began, with Bishop McKenna flagged on either side by guards with stun guns, in case Bill decided to attack the man. At first, Bill found the entire thing a little silly, and then he suddenly began to feel the same feelings that he would whenever he had an attack. He began writhing in his chair, growling, contorting his hands, events that were captured in photographs by the reporters from the people that had come along for the trip. Lorraine Warren talks about how his features, particularly his ears, seemed to elongate and come to a point, as though he were, in some minor way at least, taking on the appearance of a wolf. These were the worst physical symptoms that Bill had ever faced. Bill would lash out at the bishop but never actually attacked until right towards the end, when he suddenly jumped out of his seat and raced towards him. Bishop McKenna raised his cross and continued speaking in Latin, which seemed to subdue Bill, making him feel weak. He slowly went back to his chair and continued to writhe around in it. Bill said he suddenly felt a change, like something was leaving him, like something was purifying his system. He kept briefly blacking out, and then with one last moment of unbridled rage, he attempted to lunge towards the bishop again, before suddenly passing out. Bill awoke a changed man. A weight had been lifted from him. Abby said she had never seen him like this, or at least not for years. The couple spent a few extra days in America before thanking the Warrens and Bishop McKenna for their assistance. Despite his doubts about the exorcism, Bill Ramsey returned to England, apparently free from his affliction. He never suffered another attack again. So what really happened? The account I have just laid out for you is the event that took place according to the book the Warrens published with author Robert David Chase, just a couple of years after the exorcism took place. And unfortunately, I think, as is the case with many of the Warrens' accounts, a lot of it is totally made up nonsense. Despite the claims that the family were hounded by the press, shockingly very little additional information is available on this case. I know people who lived in the area at the time, and none of them have any memory of this story at all. However, the story was featured in an episode of Sightings in 1992, and later in the early 2000s on a British show called Jane Goldman Investigates. Both were able to not only include interviews with Bill, but also with a couple of the police officers involved in one of the attacks, while I was unable to find the original Sun article that the tabloid ran on the front page. I was able to find a later rewrite of the story from them online. All of these additional sources paint a very similar picture to each other, leaving the Warrens' book maybe expectedly as the outlier. What I can assess from these admittedly short interviews and recountings of the story is this. Bill Ramsey really did exist, and in July of 1987, he did turn up with a prostitute at Southend Police Station. The girl ran into the station that night, clearly upset, and Officer Fisher went outside to speak to Ramsey. Ramsey proceeded to attack Fisher, with numerous of the other police officers talking about how uncontrollably aggressive he was, and seemingly much stronger than he should be, throwing around Fisher like he wasn't a man twice Ramsey's size. And they confirmed he was shouting about having the devil inside him as he did this. They were able to get him into a cell, on the door of which was a small hatch. Ramsey, in a fit of rage, apparently forced himself partially through this tiny gap, getting his head and part of his arm through so he could lash out at the officers that got close to the door. Something that they state they had never seen before and didn't believe was possible. They were forced to give Ramsey multiple sedatives and were shocked when the first injection hadn't knocked the man out. They then had to bring in a fire crew who had to use soap to get the unconscious Ramsey free from the holding cell hatch. Sure enough, he was sent to Romwell the next morning, and Officer Fisher really did retire early from the trauma of the incident. In the interviews, Ramsey does make reference to the story of him ripping up the fence post as a child. He does talk about these attacks where he felt like he was transforming into a wolf, and he even makes vague references to the fact that he had bitten a nurse previously. But none of the wild stories about him attacking multiple hospital staff and battling police appears to be present. My overwhelming feeling while reading the Warrens' book was shock at why they seemingly kept letting this dangerous man go free, But now I'm convinced that either a lot of these earlier violent encounters either didn't happen, or more likely, that they have been greatly exaggerated. Although it is worth noting that in what I believe is the final interview Ramsey gave in 2004, he says that he barely remembers any of the events, and is simply repeating what others told him he did. It also does appear to be true that a number of tests were run on Ramsey that ruled out any medical issues that could have caused this, including psychological issues. But a number of experts, of course, have made the suggestion of lycanthropy, which I was shocked to discover is an actual clinical diagnosis, as well as pointing to the idea that links have been made between epilepsy and aggressive behaviour. Bill Ramsey himself even refers to these attacks on numerous occasions as seizures, although that does appear to be because he doesn't have a better word for them. There are also numerous references in the book to churches, and the Ramseys repeatedly praying, but Bill flat out says that he is not a religious man, so this seems to be another detail that was added by the Warrens. The exorcism did take place though, and Bill thought the entire idea was ridiculous, but was quite happy to get a free trip to America, having never left England before, and was genuinely out of ideas for where to turn next. He also does claim that he felt something happening during that exorcism, and that, despite not being religious before, he believes it worked, and that Bishop McKenna was able to drive out whatever had taken hold of Bill. Bill, at the very least, now appears to believe that demonic possession is a real thing, even if he doesn't quite understand exactly what that means. Regardless, it worked, and Bill Ramsey was able to live a normal life after these events. Watching the interviews with Ramsey, he just doesn't strike me as someone who would want this level of attention to make something like this up. Plus the police obviously back up at least one of his violent outbursts. He genuinely comes across as a guy who just had something odd happen to him that he just doesn't know how to explain, and now just wants to get on with his life, although I am unsure if Bill Ramsey is still with us. I think, unlike a lot of the Warrens' other cases, this one isn't spoken about as often because it is kind of out there. I mean, Ramsey didn't literally transform into a wolf, but the idea of a man at least partially transforming into some sort of creature and attacking people seemingly was a little too ridiculous compared to the Warrens' normal haunted houses and possession stories. A part of me just can't shake the feeling that Bill was unfortunately a genuinely unwell man, and that the Warrens either took advantage of this, or believed something demonic was taking place and unwittingly fed into his delusions. But even if it were just a placebo effect, the exorcism seemingly did give him his life back.
The stories in the press about me being a werewolf were totally false and exaggerated. It's true I did suffer from a strange illness, and it's true I did go to the United States for an exorcism to find the cure. But now it's all over, and I really just want to lay this werewolf business totally to rest.
Did the exorcism actually drive something demonic out of Bill Ramsey? Or are we simply looking at the power of suggestion here, and that his intense desire to be rid of whatever this affliction was meant the exorcism worked in a psychological way? What do you think? If you're watching the video, then please do drop me a comment to let me know what you think. Or if you're listening to the podcast, you can find my email in the description if you want to get in touch with your thoughts. As always, any case involving the Warrens seems to be a confusing mix of real life and fantasy. While it makes it really difficult to pinpoint what to actually believe, it does make for an entertaining story at the very least. That's all for this entry into the tape library. I hope you enjoyed this one. I really do still want to do a big deep dive into the Warrens, because despite their controversial history, they are such an important part of the paranormal world, even if it's not necessarily in a positive way. so hopefully we can get around to that soon, but I feel like that might end up being like a 6-hour video. And with that, there's nothing left to do than to thank my wonderful patrons who made tonight's episode possible. Our tape library archivists, Xavier Angle, Umiko Grimm, Tyler Michael, Tracy Torello, Sandy Lusk, Restock1731, Mira, Judith Hacker, Gabrielle, Eric Salas, Destiny M, Ash Loves Books, Alex O'Neill, Adeline, and Dean J. Daly. The lead archivists keeping you all in check, Danielle, Brian Baker, and Alex Goldberg. And our grand overseers who watch all the archivists work hard from their plush office with the good coffee, Forevan, Morning Rain 2619, Katie, and Agent 355. Thank you all so much for your continued support. I'm not sure what the next episode is 100% going to be yet, but I've got a lot of fun ones planned. So until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.